Good morning and welcome to the third in the Bio-Art Conversations. Today we've got the artist Kamil Hassim and we've got Professor Scientist Tobias Barnard. These two have been working together on projects that center on water. And what we need to understand is what each of them grasp by water, what it means as a material that defines human life. But before getting to their understandings, I was reminded of a line by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his poem, The Ancient Mariner, when he speaks about water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. He was talking about seawater, but the point is, here we are landlocked, in Johannesburg, dealing with a major water crisis. It's the lack of access to water that's concerning, the quality of water that's concerning, the meaning of water. How do we reconcile this modern moment in history and the problems we face in terms of not only water shortage, but water cleanliness and water culture? And how do we reconcile this in relationship to, for example, traditional or indigenous knowledge systems of how water operates in society? It seems it's a fact to say that water defines us. That's true. But it defines us differently at different moments of history because of the stresses and strains that impact upon us. That's the one thing I want to think about. But eternally, in that immortal sense, and Kamil, my apologies. Kamil, in terms of your work, that idea of an ancient knowledge of water is so central. And here I was thinking about very basic facts about being human. One, that we are amphibian, that we exist between land and water. And two, if we think about the most ancient forms of art, which is making art with clay, is a combination of earth and water. So water is central in terms of our creativity, our civilizations, our sense of our own beings, our mortality, our history, and our modern moment. Now, I'd like to find out from the two of you your own approaches to water and how this collaboration came about. Tobias.
Sure. I come at water from a purely academic standpoint, where I am in the Water and Health Research Center, and we study how water is contaminated via hygiene or whatever sources, how people interact with water, and then how the scientific part or the more microbiological part, how the bacteria adapt and to become more resistant to cause disease. So a lot of the work that we've been focusing on is exactly what you've been saying: is how do we decrease the distance to water? How do we increase the access to water? How do we train or educate people about the hygiene related to water to reduce the potential for disease? And how do we make practical solutions to take to the communities? A simple example would be hand washing stations. And like you said, we've been seeing some serious stories in Johannesburg about schools not having access to water, the parents complaining about the diseases, and by installing a simple hand wash station that's made from a Coke bottle and an old syringe, you can wash hands and you can reduce that. So our approach to water has always come from that, studying the impact on the humans and the humans' impact on the water, and how we can uplift our communities and ensure that our communities at least have access to safe water.
Can I ask a question in this regard? So you're trying to understand the impact of water on society and how it changes with time. Now, for example, do you feel that we need to accelerate our understanding of what water means and how water functions in life? Do we need training programs? Do we need community awareness programs to help us to better understand how to utilize water and how to manage it?
I do believe so. My friends are going to kill me. I see some of my friends still using water from a tap to water the garden, which is something we should not be doing. We should be using grey water to water the gardens to save water. We always say in the center, you need to strive to buy once but use twice, so that you buy it for drinking purposes, what we treated the water, not for gardening, because why would you use treated expensive water to water your garden. So I think there's a lot that we need to do with the communities to show we need to respect the water and we need to look after the water, because South Africa is a water scarce country. I think the Water Resource Commission said by 2030 all available water would have been allocated to uses. So meaning that we cannot build more industry after that. We cannot build anything or expand anything after 2030. But we can push that forward if we become smart about how we work with water.
Well, two things. One, the importance of being smart in working with water, the catchy phrase about buying once and using twice. But at the same time, you've also given us quite an apocalyptic vision, given the water scarcity. How do we move forward? How does a civilization, a society continue in the absence of water? And in this context, Kamil, I wanted to bring up the idea of, so if we've got a scientific, pragmatic approach, commonsensical approach to how to improve upon services and improve upon the qualities of water, it seems to me that you're also locked into something more ancient in your grasp of the significance of water.
Sure, yeah. I think at the start of the residency, I mean, a lot of the kind of more practical solutions to some of the problems that we're facing are, of course, linked to the problems themselves and the where that originates. And part of that, I think, is potentially people's misconceptions about the availability of resources on the planet. It's not just about water, but, you know, in terms of everything. And previous attitudes humans had, say pre the industrial age or even during, around you know, the burning of fossil fuels, the use of physical resources, and any impact that would have on the planet. And one of the things that interested me was this idea that because we're constantly consuming and expelling water, in many ways you can think of the Earth's kind of water bodies in its oceans, its rivers, as extensions of the human body, because we're in constant conversation with that as a cyclical process. And of course, we are also living organisms which exist on a branch of evolution which originated from life that began, what we think probably in water. And so even the water that's on the planet itself is part of this broader cosmological process. So at the start of the residency, I kind of wanted to look at it from that point of view of water not as a resource or as a distinct thing, but actually as this cyclical process, of course, which exists in multiple phases of matter, which passes through living organisms. The human body is mostly water. And so in many ways, I began to think of water as kind of the medium for consciousness itself to take shape. And that's an attitude, I think, that's reflected in a lot of different ancient philosophical frameworks. And from that comes a very different attitude toward it, because if this is now this cosmological process of which I'm inherently a part, I'll treat it fundamentally differently to if this is a resource that I can use, and I think inbuilt in that, which you can see in various indigenous societies, but not to generalize, is attitudes towards the natural world with a kind of inbuilt climate consciousness, because this is not some distinct thing from me, I'm interconnected with it.
Here, what you're saying connects with Tobias's work, because why? If you want to understand water as a medium for consciousness, that applies as much to an understanding of the spiritual cultures which defined and formed how water is placed in the imagination of the community. But that's exactly what you're trying to do as well in a much more pragmatic way. It's not simply about being rational about water awareness, but trying to understand more subtly how the practice of using water, the practice of saving water, is something that's deeply tied to our DNA as human beings, but also the DNA of the entire cosmology of all beings who inhabit the planet. So in a sense, humans have to understand their place amongst others in the chain of being. Humans must understand their place in the immediate confines of the society they occupy. And here it raises another issue, Tobias, about the whole nature of class in the context, and this is also for you, Kamil, who has access to water? Right. And to say just the politics of that is not sufficient because it's tied to a series of complex notions of humanity and inhumanity, those deemed human, those deemed non-human, sort of who are human beings, who has access to what? The nature of privilege. So can we talk about these aspects in relationship to water?
Interesting you bring that up because I've had to deal and think a lot about privilege and access to water for work that we were doing now for installation. And like you said, we are again in a changing system where what we thought the way water was is going to change drastically. We thought that living in Johannesburg, you would always have access to water. I can open my tap, there will be water. There's more and more water interruptions, burst pipes. I can see 2-3 days without water at my place. So now the whole use of water is changing because more and more people are installing water barriers at their households. So they're doing a 20 litre to a 50 litre barrier, so that if the water goes out, they still have water. Or 10,000 litre barriers. So now privilege and access to water is shifting even within an urban setting because I cannot do that at my place. So when there's no water, I don't have water. And people who can do that, who's allowed to do that, will now have water. So I think in this system, everything is changing continuously, and we're seeing the next phase of how water access and privilege will be defined by simply who can afford to install barriers. So I think that's something that we need to consider, because I cannot, and I don't want to sound like doom and gloom, I cannot see it changing quickly enough within the next few years that everything will go back to a few years where there was no water interruptions. And I think that's where we need to rethink water, and that's why it was so interesting speaking with Kamil, because the way he thought about water helped me to rethink the way I think about water.
I mean, it's a tricky thing because so much of this, I think, is based on experience, and because there's this illusion we live in of, here's this mechanism, there's a tap, I turn it on and water comes out. And it's opaque, the process through which that water really gets there. I mean, when I was working with Tobias's lab, I learned a lot about how the water is treated, the chemicals that are used, and we visited some spaces where there was limited water access. And it made me realize, well, in learning the infrastructure it takes to supply water to a city like Johannesburg, how much you take that for granted. So it completely reshaped my perception of, my own access to water. And then during the Fluid Boundaries residency, I went to Limpopo with the other scientist, Nebo Jovanovic, and he works with a series of rural farmers out in Limpopo. And one of the days we went on a trip to see where the local people get their water, and they actually dig it up from a dry riverbed. So there's this massive dry riverbed which flows in some seasons and is otherwise dry, but the water is underneath the ground. And so they dig it to wash their clothes, to drink it, and they drink it as it is, from the ground, which actually isn't good for them because there's a lot of there's no sewage systems. So there's a lot of E. coli that leaches into that river system. So people get sick, but they don't know it. Then as we're standing there kind of, watching these kids who are, digging water and handing it to each other, I also started to get thirsty, and I became aware of the fact that I had a 2-liter Volpre bottle in my bag, and I realized, instinctively, you aren't thirsty, and then I thought, like, wait a minute, this would be totally inappropriate for me to take out this kind of store-bought bottle of water when this is how these guys have to access it. And I realized, like, even that is a thing we take for granted, that you can walk into a shop and purchase this resource, whereas they have a very different relationship to it because this is how they spend their Sunday morning. They spend the whole day collecting water for the rest of the week, and they have to physically carry it. And I imagine that changes your relationship to it. If it takes more to get it, you're going to treat it very differently to if you can turn on a tap, if the access is so easy as it is for us. But of course, as Tobias is mentioning, that ease of access is kind of disconnected from the reality, which is that it really is actually a scarce resource, but at a timeline that's maybe difficult for people to comprehend because we're talking decades.
Yeah.
Speaking of water as a scarce resource, the first thing I want to bring up, but not the thing I want to focus on immediately, is the difference then between water wars and water ecologies. So I'd like you to keep that in mind. But before then, I want to pick up on Kamil's point about the illusory nature of a tap. You know, you turn it on and water appears, or the ease of access to water by buying it at a supermarket versus, you know, having to dig it up from the ground. Entirely different cultures which coexist in this country right now.
Yes.
These different practices happen simultaneously. So what interests me here is that there is a work by the sculptor Randy Hartzenberg and painter where he takes a tap and then he bandages it to a cough mixture bottle. So you've got this graphic sense visually of what you think something's supposed to do, but then it's qualified by this notion of a problem attached to it. And that was done in the 1990s. The reason I'm bringing it up is because how do you create a heightened awareness, but not simply as a matter of knowledge? You know, at schools they teach you, for example, about sort of hygiene, and there are always practical solutions about how to fix a problem. But it seems to me you don't just fix a problem with practical solutions, but the practical solutions have to be aligned with an imaginative, spiritual, cultural solution, which is less easily tangible, but as important. And it's the reason why the two of you are here and why the two of you are collaborating, because you're trying to find that point, what I think you call the fluid boundary between art and science, between traditional customs, between access by digging up the land, by having access to taps, which, as you say, are malfunctioning. Water resources in supermarkets are not always necessarily there. And living at this moment in our society on a kind of comparative edge, you know, the level of uncertainty about access and non-access of the most fundamental element in our lives. Could you talk about that and then return to how to evolve and move beyond water wars and water privation and control and domination to water ecologies which become much more inclusive and sharing spaces?
Okay. So, very interesting approach. And I think the best way I can answer you is to give you some examples of the way that we've been approaching things and why we were drawn to the fluid boundaries and to working with artists. We realized a while back that there are so many scientists shouting facts at us. There's so many shouts going, the end of water, the end of this, the climate change. There's so many things that people have started becoming numb to it. It's just another scientist, doom and gloom, blah, blah, blah. We also realized that in today's society, if the message is not in 20 to 30 seconds, it's lost. So I got a bunch of young ones in my center, and I said, get me science that is interesting, and I'm trying to use the words that they used to get instant gratification out of science while teaching things. And they came up with a system of seeing as believing science. Because if you can show people things, they will understand it better than just hearing the things. And the example we always give is by showing people with fluorescent dyes how hygiene impacts the spread of disease, the way you interact with water. Because like you were saying, in rural areas, they collect the water, they interact with the water, but they don't understand how the disease is transferred. So now we go there, we put the dye on, we say, okay, interact. Then we put a black light on and they can see where they touched and how things go. So the seeing is believing approach is what I think is where scientists need to go to start bringing over the messages. To go, listen here, you're contaminating things. You're not working, you're not thinking. How can we show you the stuff and show you the solutions? Because I think people really want to try, but it's daunting. And I can only draw from my own experience starting to work with artists. It was daunting because I had to learn a new language, I had to learn a lot of new things, and I think that the community feels the same. And that's what drew me initially to working with Via, with all the artists and with Kamil and them, to learn from them, but also find a way of communicating with the communities in a different way.
Yeah, it's a very complex question, and I don't know that there's necessarily easy answers to it. But one of the things that kind of struck me in seeing that the experiment you just talked about with the hand washing, and I'm going to be a little bit critical if you don't mind. Is so what Tobias's lab attempted to do was kind of gamify the experience of water washing, where a group of school kids came and they go through this whole process of putting on this cream, washing their hands, and seeing it under black light, and then as a reward they get a 3D printed plastic toy. And of course I kind of understood that, and when I asked the team that was leading this, but what happens to the toy down the line, and they were like, oh, we'd have to kind of analyze that or do a study on that. And I thought, no, common sense tells you this ends up in a waterway because you're giving this to kids from rural informal settlements, and it's a cheap plastic toy. We were all kids once. It captures your attention for a bit, and then becomes a pollutant. So I became kind of interested there in the approach of scientists to kind of the way they look at data and accumulating data, but then because things are often so structured in institutions or processes, it kind of removes you from the more kind of obvious or practical things that as an artist I would go, but you don't need to do a study on this, you can intuit where this goes, But it's a complex thing, of course, to solve, because on the one hand, it is a very engaging way of showing how we're constantly touching things all the time, and that all transfers, and that kind of goes back to me to this, the idea I brought up earlier about water as a cyclical process, but really that ties into everything being part of this kind of interconnected mesh. And so during the time that I was looking at the fluid, I was in the fluid boundaries, I was really getting into these kind of ancient Indian philosophical ideas, a lot of which speak to what frontier science is now learning in terms of frameworks of understanding. So a lot of what the evidence is suggesting now created over time all these paradigm shifts in thinking. I mean, if we look at physics, from Newtonian physics to quantum physics, it fundamentally shifted the way people understood the world, and it required now a new philosophical way of reckoning with this new understanding of nature. And a lot of actually the implications of a quantum world is kind of consolidated or understood within, say, an ancient Indian context or Tibetan context. They have words for certain phenomena like superposition or uncertainty. And one of the kind of core ideas which I thought really related to what I was interested in this residency was this idea of dependent origination, merely that every event that occurs is existing in an interconnected web of cause and effect. Nothing happens independently of other events happening that set up that event to happen. And then that event also creates the potential for new events to happen. And so when you start to look at it that way, you recognize that this phenomenon of, the tap, for instance, is one part of this complex system that's interconnected not only to the physical infrastructure human beings are making, but then also to the natural processes that's happening on the planet, and then of course the way the planet formed in conversation with the broader cosmos, and then the direction that all of that is sort of headed, And that kind of starts to create an image which is very different to the image of, the kind of suburban illusion of there's access to resources. You start to understand that that person in Limpopo that's digging up their water is fundamentally interconnected to me and my use of that tap. They're not separate at all. And in fact, there's even a logical, if you were to look at it, a logical set of causes and conditions which connect us. Maybe it is that piece of plastic that finds its way into a waterway that's actually somewhere in the infrastructure of the tap that I open. It's invisible to me, but it's there. So this understanding that we're sharing this, whether we like it or not, we share this planet, we share these resources, and actually the actions that I commit, they have this ripple effect. They have this kind of butterfly effect, and that they affect this thing in this other way on the other side of the world. It is true, and yeah, I guess in India this is something that's kind of a fully fleshed out pedagogy, and that's just one instance of it. But I think there's many examples of this understanding that, the impact I have on the world, it ripples out and affects other things. And so that should inform how I act.
Listening to both of you in this regard, two words that crop up are slowness and speed, and basically the concurrence of two ways of living and understanding life. For example, Tobias, when you spoke about the message needs to be sent quickly, it's about swiftness, it's about economy, it's about what you mentioned earlier on about instant gratification. Now, the interesting thing about this is that that is seen as a practical solution, yes, as a way of teaching and helping people, but it's also locked to a much more complex notion of capitalism, which is built around instant gratification. It's all about speed, it's about immediacy, it's about now. In South Africa we call now. This moment becomes crucial. Whereas the world that Kamil is talking about is about slowness. It's about a complex, interdependent web tied to quantum physics, tied to religions, that gives us a much broader grasp of how to bring together all the meanings that make up life. So, at the moment, it seems to me the paradox that we're occupying is the one between the efficacies of speed and the problems of speed. The efficacies of slowness, but also how do you translate the idea of the longue durée, the great expanse of time, and how do you make that accessible to human beings, who are largely defined by capitalism, therefore by instant gratification, and therefore by speed. My final question in this regard is, what kind of humans are we? Can we find solutions for the problems we are living in when we are trapped in a culture of speed and have no grasp of history, precious little grasp of spirituality, and no understanding of truly of the longue durée? And I hope that is clear to both of you in terms of a speculative position I want to throw at you.
It's another complex question, but I think a core part of this is we are a kind of a composite of all the media that we consume. Media in the sense of the ideas, the conversations, the images, the sounds that kind of wash over us. So for instance, how is it that the people in Limpopo understand where to find the water that they dig up? And it's because they exist in an environment where their physical experiences intergenerationally prime the body in a particular way. There's data that is being perceived, that is passed down generationally, that primes them to understand things. So put me in that same environment, for instance, I probably wouldn't have thought, if I dig here, I'm going to find water. Right. But they know this because it's a form of kind of embodied knowledge. It's an indigenous knowledge. And I think similarly in a modern world, we are, we're exposed to this kind of diet of very high saturation information. And a lot of the ideas and, our entire worldview, I think, is created by the kind of information that we're engaging with and digesting with. And how often do we actually sit and imagine and conceive of the world within the paradigm of our own imagination, as opposed to, I saw this thing on Instagram, or I read that article, or there's this idea here, and we don't really engage with it, but there's something that sticks out to us, and now we subscribe to this idea. But it's not really our idea, and it's not really based on our relative, subjective, as an individual, experience of things. And I mean, so the kind of the concept I brought up of dependent origination is a precursor to this other kind of spiritual practice of meditations that simply go, okay, as a human being we suffer, and why do we suffer? And is there a way to alleviate that? And yet the claim is, yes, there is, and it's through compassion for others, actually. And there's a way to cultivate this. And here's a set of exercises to do that. And what really kind of struck me about these very ancient meditation practices is essentially what they were visualization exercises. They were kind of, as I understood them, algorithms for the mind, where you sit, you have an intention, and then you imagine a set of images that can kind of cultivate that intention. That, and Stanford has done studies on this, actually neurologically lead to shifts in the chemistry of the brain and the attitudes of your own consciousness. So the same event is now suddenly a different thing to you because you've changed the way you think about it. And so that got me thinking about, wow, in an internet age where we're seeing all of these kind of composite ideas, what does it do to us when we're constantly consuming things, but we're not always conscious of what those things are and how they subtly start to form a worldview? So you look at that in the context of social media now, and why is it that the US is trying to disenfranchise ByteDance's ownership of TikTok and trying to create a new kind of collection of owners in the US that are supporters of Trump? It's because they recognize that this is a medium through which, especially with the algorithms, you can shape the consciousnesses of a group of people because you're feeding them a diet of information. And they don't trust the Chinese to do this, so they want to do it themselves, but they obviously pose a similar thing in the sense that...
In this regard, what's interesting, Tobias, it's intriguing. You're speaking here, Kamil, about compassion and the necessity for compassion. You're also speaking about expediency, the manipulation of algorithms. But what you spoke about, Tobias, which I thought was also very interesting, it's about, in relation to bacteria, is how to decrease the distance to water. That's tied to it's also a form of compassion. It's not only about a scientific solution or merely a pedagogic growing of awareness. It's about, if you have a compassionate understanding to the materials you depend on, it changes your grasp of how you relate to the world, how you live inside of it. The same thing, if you have a much more thoughtful engagement with, say, an interactive social mediatized world, you no longer just become a consumer of it. You can negotiate it. So it seems both of you, dealing in very seemingly different spheres, are asking the same question: how can human beings become more compassionate? And what is the tropological significance of water in relationship to building a healthier civilization, a healthier humanity, one that can actually survive?
So I need to backtrack 2 seconds to what Kamil was saying, is that, and it speaks to what you were asking about how we build the society and the relationship, is that where I always have to balance the two worlds of the minister in the NSTF awards during his speech said, science that do not reach the community is not what we need in South Africa. We need science that reaches the community. So I always have to balance to go, how do I find something that's practical that I can impact the people now? Because I constantly reminded that everybody that's paying for water is paying for my research, because as part of the subsidy goes to the Water Research Commission. They fund our projects to solve the queries. So I always have to balance about thinking about and thinking about the future with practical on the ground work. Hence our combination of more social media approach in real life. Because we need to get all people to understand that this is going to be a joint effort. We can't have one group going, okay, I can do this and you can bear the burden, but we all need to work together on getting this message across. We need to get society on board to understand that this year, I may not have to wash my car twice a week, or I need to do something differently. How do I use the people around us? And how do people, the resources around us, to get to the point where we can start creating this change of people understanding that water is crucial to life. Without water, we cannot survive. And we need to protect it, and we need to make sure that we have equal access to everybody, but also a good quality. And if that's not there, what's practical solutions that we can bring in and put in place to help the people do it? We do a lot of work in Limpopo as well, where we have to look at how do we make sure that the water quality that they get is clean. That's where where my work always stops, and that's where I always go to Kamil and to Brenton and them to go, now speak to me about the philosophy. Now speak to me, help me understand the bigger things. Help me understand from a different approach on how to think about this, because it is going to be a team sport to get to where we need to be. We need everybody involved to go, I don't understand human nature maybe, but I understand how to get the water purified. And I think that's what conversations with Camille's also brought for me to go, think of this, like the toys, and the potential impact. It's something that we have to reflect on and go, okay, what could be the impact of the toys? The idea is good now, but let's think about the next step. So I think, and I hope I answered, I think a very long way
Well,
around.
I really agree with also Tobias's, for me, I also feel if the work doesn't have some kind of accessible impact on society, what's the point of it? Even from an art perspective. And I think what I think science and art can do together is that they're asking very similar questions, but they have radically different methods and liberties in how they explore those questions. Because for Tobias, there is the need for a particular output, and for an artist, there's more freedom in what that output could be, but at the same time, that freedom could potentially create the conditions for a very impactful output in and of itself. I think of Oliver Eliasson's installation here in Johannesburg, I think in 1997, where he opened the tank of water and let it run through the street. And by doing that, people don't know that this is an artwork, this is just water running down the street, but it changed the way the city negotiated navigating the city. People interact with this thing in different ways. Kids play in it, people jump over it, they take different routes to work. And so this idea of art not existing in special contexts like galleries or museums, but being part of the fabric of everyday life, I think for me also ties into kind of indigenous philosophies around art, which is these aren't kind of separate artifacts or things being produced by society, but they are the kind of core, foundation layer that sets up the ideas and conceptions, and then the way that society even imagines itself is produced by the culture.
Right. Leonard Bernstein has a remark here. He said that art doesn't change events, but it changes the people who change events. So I think that's really intriguing in terms of understanding the role of art in this sense, which, as you say, doesn't have the same pragmatic throughput that science claims to have. Here I wanted to talk about your third space residency, because I think this is connected very much to what you two have been working with. You took, and your field work and your lab work, for example, the field work in Hillbrow and Berea, trying to find those practical places that you actively work in, and how does that relate to your lab work, and what is the third space residency?
That's a good question. So the current Fluid Boundaries residency is a series of cohorts of artists and scientists from South Africa, Switzerland, and Brazil. And we've kind of been peripherally following what each of the different groups are doing, but it'll be our first opportunity to actually meet each other and to share and exchange in what we've been thinking about and what kind of has come out of that. So I think in a lot of ways, the third space residency is an opportunity. Well, for me, I'm really interested in the different approaches that the different groups have taken, because their teams are very, very different. They're thinking in very different cultural contexts. Their questions are very different, and I think their projects are almost totally distinct from ours, But of course, they're all connected through water, which for me is probably the most compelling kind of element of water, is the fact that it is this kind of broad, infinite process when you look at it from a cosmological perspective, but at the same time, it's something that fundamentally connects virtually every event on the planet, from the kind of daily lived reality of a person trying to survive to the kind of frontier technologies now with AI and data centers. It's a necessary resource for virtually everything we're doing in every level, and so that aspect of it is what I find quite compelling. Yeah.
I think for me, what I'm excited about the third space is that it's going to be the first time that I get to see everything and everybody. We've met everybody on Zoom meetings, and we've heard a bit of everything. And there's so many questions I just want to ask. So go, okay, you said this, you did this, your experience is this. Can we chat about it? And I think that's why I'm getting excited, to have a week and just sit with curators, traditional knowledge facilitators, the artists and the other scientists, and just just have time to talk freely, without a time limit of a Zoom meeting, without a time limit of anything. Just go, let's see where it goes, because this is, I mean, I'm always pro-water because water flows everywhere. We want to touch everything. And I think by letting the thought process go, it will mimic water, and it will just go where it's supposed to go. And that's what I'm excited about.
Mm.
Is this happening in Switzerland? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So is it a colloquium, a conference, a gathering of?
I guess all of the above, yeah.
I think it's defined as a workshop, but it's meant to be a space where we get us all together, and they'll challenge us with questions or with activities and see how we collaborate and how we come up with ideas and what we talk about. So.
We always talk about the fact that we are, at the most extreme moment in history. The sense of exaggerating the crises that we live in at our particular moments, but gatherings like this, they are surely connected to an acute understanding of the precarity of life on the planet. Is this one of the driving forces behind producing this kind of a gathering? Or is it something much calmer, more sedate, less concerned with finality and the end of things?
I think from my understanding, it's less dramatic, more how do we get all these different people in the room to start talking about the future, and how to get to create more of these spaces, because, and I think Kamil will say, we've all learned a lot from each other that's impacted the way that we think and we do, and I think when we start putting international people together, it's going to have an amazing, hopefully, knock-on effect to go, what's the future problem, what's the next problem, how do we take this to societies? So I don't think it's meant to be, but it will always get to that point where somebody's background will bring in the reality back to the workshop for us.
Well, the other element of this, I think, which is equally important, aside with the science and the art, is the indigenous knowledge systems and the conveners that represent that will be at this workshop. And so I'm quite excited at the prospect of, I get to work closely with Dr. George Mahashe here in South Africa, but to be able to meet with the Brazilian indigenous knowledge convener and learn about their context. She doesn't even speak English. She has to have a translator. And one of the things that came up between us via the translator for me was this idea of, I'm really curious what kind of concepts exist in your culture that I have no access to because I don't have the language. And for me, language in many ways, George kind of awakened me to this notion that a word is really a hyperlink to a body of knowledge, because if you're of that language and that culture, embedded, encoded in that word is a whole kind of system of ideas. And if you don't speak it, to translate the word, it doesn't do anything. And so this is actually something that I've been trying to navigate even in the context of this residency with that awareness, because a lot of the kind of philosophies that I mentioned earlier that came from ancient India have these kind of words. So I said here dependent origination in the hopes that maybe that's more accessible for people. But really the word is pratitya samutpada, which means something entirely different in Sanskrit, but evokes that pedagogy or that epistemology. And so to somebody who kind of knows that word connects to a whole series of other words and other ideas. And so that potential in the residency now, in the third space residency, to kind of engage across those paradigms. And I think that's really what it is. It's, information looks one way if you're processing it from within a particular paradigm, as a scientist, as an artist, as a person of this culture, as a person from that culture. But if you shift the paradigm, that same data set takes on a very different shape and means something very different.
That seems to be the crucial thing about the shifting of the paradigm. Because as you said, you can't simply translate from one language to another and assume the meaning carries through. Because as Walter Benjamin says, translation is a disarticulation. And that's why your emphasis is on origination. It's a certain kind of primary holistic vision that you're holding on to in this very deconstructed current moment, to find a way to return to a space that is a balm, is a space of coherence and completion, and of spiritual reinvigoration. Seems to be central to the way you are speaking. But at the same time, as I said, that can be done on the ground and finding pragmatic solutions inside of a lived society. Tobias, so it seems to me there are genuine crossovers and links between your positions, even though the point of entry might differ. I want to just now, in this closing sort of sequence, just go independently, and I'd like to speak to you about certain aspects of your work, Kamil, because here transdisciplinarity seems to be the central thing. You know, you speak about working with engineers, with marine biologists, with architects, economists, astronomers, disciplines of varying kinds which somehow need to interpenetrate to create a new kind of coherence. Is this the way forward for humanity, is crossing over broadly the sciences and the arts, finding connections across seeming differences? Is this what you mean by fluid boundaries in the work practices that both of you do?
I absolutely do think. I firmly believe that each of us have our role to play in this, and it's what I think fluid boundaries helped us is to start bringing the parts together so that the information can flow from one to another. Because, and I know that it's not always the most popular view, scientists don't like talking to people. We like lab work. We like talking to other scientists. But we need to get our information out. So we need to work with the people in humanities. We need to work with the scientists, with the artists, to see, train us, teach us, help us get the ideas out. So in my mind, this fluid boundaries is but the starting point of bringing so many things, possibilities together to go, this is a problem that we have to do. Let's find a solution that everybody contributes to that will have an impact in society.
Yeah, I think for me, specialist knowledge is crucially important because it offers a depth of understanding at a particular thing, but what it lacks is perspective. And so with transdisciplinarity comes the potential to actually, in a sense, become a specialist of generalist, in a sense, because by having a deep enough knowledge of a series of topics, for instance, that I can engage scientists like Tobias about their work meaningfully, but at the same time hold a broader basis of knowledge in fields that are completely unrelated, allows me to understand what he's doing in a context that's very different to the context he would understand it in.
Right.
And that could benefit both of us, of course, and then of course in the conversation of things, because then ultimately as an artist I'm interested in the stories that tells and then the ways to formulate that to kind of, in a sense, I see art as having the potential to kind of enlighten society, to kind of point towards the kind of core truths of things, and not to convince people through an academic essay or an article, but through like the raw experience of the thing, which is itself a manifestation of that knowledge, So I think like the great kind of Renaissance artists do this, like you see a Michelangelo sculpture and you think like that thing is going to move, but if you told me that, and you can turn that rock into something that looks and feels like a human being, I wouldn't believe you. But now the artwork doesn't explain that, it just is that thing, And I think for me, great art does that. It is a synthesis of that energy, that intangible something that is itself also embedded within it is also like deep knowledge, deep technical knowledge. It's not just expression, but it's pointing to some kind of core truth of the universe. And
that's what Tobias is also saying in terms of great social practice, is that it's a form of seeing as believing. It's a form of illumination. So it seems across the board, the key thing that's binding the two of you is how to illuminate knowledge, how to clarify practice, how to connect with people, and how to rehumanize the destroyed global civilization. In this regard, I want to pick up on some really intriguing formulations of yours, Kamil, here. This particular one where you speak about it's not so much, which one is it? Okay, it's over here. The scientific method didn't just inform my work technically, it became the basis for a conceptual dialogue about the ethics and metaphysics of measurement itself. We're talking about the eddy covariance system. So that becomes, as I understand it, with my limited knowledge, a practical way to manage water. But for you, it's the epistemology, not the method, that becomes more important. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, if you don't mind me kind of giving a kind of a historical anecdote, I mean, for me, what illustrated this in a very potent way was the history of oceanic navigation in human beings, within human culture. Because around the time that the Europe was beginning to kind of colonize everybody, they didn't have an ability to navigate the open ocean. They could only kind of sail through along the coastline. And very ingeniously, a British man by the name of John Harrison realized the solution to navigating space was to be able to calculate time. And he handmade from wood a clock that was, at that time, at a point in history, the most accurate clock that had ever been built. He submitted that, and it wasn't deemed as a legitimate answer to the solution. But his thinking was, if you had two of these clocks, and they were very accurate, and you sailed out from your port city, and one clock was set to your port, you would know when noon was wherever you were because of the sun, and you could calculate the time difference with the clock that told you what the time was back home. And from there, you could triangulate your position. That clock was then given to Captain Cook, who used it to discover Hawaii. And when he gets there, he discovers this very complex web of indigenous people who are sailing seemingly across all these massive expanses of open water, and had a history of kind of engagement. Now, this is scientifically impossible from the culture that Captain Cook comes from, because these guys don't have any of this technology.
Right.
And so for years, through a long process of colonization, the knowledge of how to do this was destroyed, and the culture was on the brink of a collapse until in the 1970s, two people, indigenous Hawaiians, found one of the last remaining wayfinders, who were one of the people who understood the old system of navigating without a compass, a clock, a map. And they revived this, and they did the first ever navigation in a replica of an ancient canoe of their ancestors from Hawaii to Tahiti, which I think is a 2,500 nautical mile distance. And in so doing, they proved that what the West had been calling for years a scientific impossibility was indeed possible. What struck me about that was that here is this common problem, which is an observational scientific problem. How do you navigate the open ocean? On the British side, they developed an instrument that enabled them to do that. On the Polynesian side, they developed a complex cultural paradigm that turned the human body itself into the instrument through which you could do this. Very different attitudes. And so to me, what this spoke to is that we share this physical reality, but the way that we navigate that reality is very much dependent on our worldview. The Polynesians were never going to invent a clock. They weren't going to industrialize. They weren't going to develop that kind of technology. Similarly, the British were never going to invent wayfinding because they didn't have that kind of cultural tapestry that viewed the world in that particular way. So that, kind of distinction between our relative cultural paradigms and the way they give us access to the world, we could be in the same shared space and completely miss concrete, observational information purely because of the way we're primed to view, the lens through which we see the world.
In this regard, to return to the Swiss issue again, the gathering that you're going to, what interests me here is that there are different paradigms, right? They are non-parallel. They are entirely and utterly different. Mm-hmm. But what brings them together in this regard, and this is another formulation of yours, Kamil, as water was the foundational medium through which life and consciousness arose. If water is the foundational medium, that then irrespective of the paradigm used to understand and move and navigate, it's looking at the other elemental and more primal source and understanding how different societies have actually engaged with it that will help us to actually survive. So we've got to then be transdisciplinary, we've got to listen each to each as Martin Buber would say, I and thou. We've got to restore compassion, which is the basis of your scientific practice. And we've got to find a way in which to cross boundaries as efficiently, as effectively, as productively, as humanely as possible. For that to happen, we must de-hierarchize value. We must change the way we see civilizations, how we relate north to south, east to west, to create a truly planetary humanism as a foundation, with water as the foundational medium.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to recognize that we're all human beings. And so these different formulations that different cultures have of different realities, which contain different possibilities, are not things for us to contend with, but things that we could potentially benefit from trying to understand, not by absorbing it into our own context, but being able to suspend ourselves to see the world from the other person's point of view. That we can only enrich our own perspective on things and allow us to see the world, I think, more accurately for what it really is. And this seems to be the kind of crucial moment in our time right now, is there are all these tensions in the world globally between my way versus your way, as opposed to recognizing that that there is a way in which this contributes to a shared complexity and a shared nuance that tells the story of what does it mean to be a human being.
Mm-hmm. Henry David Thoreau makes the interesting remark. He says, the only way to understand the world is one is able to see through another its miracle. And it's that level of engagement that is critical. But as you're saying, Kamil, at this historical moment, when we're becoming increasingly more divisive, I mentioned water wars as a metaphor for radical accelerations in inequality. How then do we countermand that violence, that hatred, that bigotry, that divisiveness, which is worldwide, which is basically almost like a science fiction novel, has returned us to our own fiefdoms, our own isolated pockets, we stand there with our barriers to separate ourselves from other people, to protect the resources that we have. How then, against that selfishness, does one find a way to create the greater connections that will allow the entire Earth to survive? I recall one scientist saying to me that, not me personally, via a video, that, yes, we are the most intellectual species, and yet at the same time, we're the ones who are destroying the planet, which is a paradox.
It's amazing. I can't offer a how, but when you were speaking, my father's voice just came back to me, and I know there's somebody that said this, but I heard it from my father, where he said, history will always repeat itself until we learn the lessons. And I think it's finally time. We have everything at our fingertips. I can get my phone and go get a whole history of everything. Somehow we forget to learn the lessons. Somehow we forget to learn, okay, what happened? What can we do differently? Like Kamil's been saying, we've been looking at it from our lens, from one side. It's time for us to just sit back and go, okay, how do we look at the history, what we've learned, how do we go forward, and just calm down to a slight panic and then have a discussion. Because I think a lot of the stuff can be worked out, whether it's shared spaces or whatever we're looking for. Access to water, how we manage water, everything can be solved by just looking back and go, what did we do? The example I always give is that the World Health Organization, when we do water quality, one of the best ways to purify water is a 3-pot system that comes from our forefathers. That had 3 pots, you put the water in, you let it settle, you take the top water to take the next settle, and you purify the water in a basic way. But we're losing that, and we're not talking to each other to go, why do we have complex systems when something simple could have worked? And I think it's time that we just sit down and go, where in history did we start going wrong? What could we have done? And how can we transfer that knowledge to now? And hopefully work on a more peaceful civilization at large. But I don't have a practical answer.
On that very beautiful note, if there's anything you wish to add before we conclude.
I was just going to say, in terms of the answer to that, for me, what is the antidote to these problems? At the risk of sounding a bit silly, but also because I think it's true. It really goes back to compassion. It goes back to love. If we can act from that place, that's a creative force as opposed to a destructive force. And it's just a pity that we live in a time now where the kind of medium through which information transmits in the internet happens to have a bias towards hate and divisiveness and attention. And so it's not that I think that love doesn't exist, it's just that it's not platformed enough in the same way. And if we can invert that and have that be the louder voice, I think we'll start to see a lot of the solutions to these kind of manifest themselves organically. Because water, water is a medium for life and consciousness. Love too then is a consequence of that process. There's some seed of that, I think, in water itself that we can tap into and draw from.
Yes. On that note, the rendering water sacred again, rendering humanity a space of compassion, rendering civilization something that can be achieved and growth is possible and wellness is possible, which is the core spirit expressed by both of you in different ways, by Tobias and by Kamil. I'd like to thank you both very much for this conversation. Thank you.